Brilliant.
Maybe there should be
Kevin.
regulations against alarmist reporting. I mean, the guy's going in for a routine operation.
Yeah, Kevin...
I think he was feeding and fueling all the reporting of it, Barry. Far from being a kind of unwilling, a focal point of all that. I think the only person possibly that, or only entity that wasn't interviewed in relation to it was the possible donor of his stint.
Yes, yeah. I think we should really feel for the invasion of Kevin's privacy over all of this. But I'm told that Kevin was so meticulous in dealing with this issue that on Wednesday when he announced, or before he announced it, he rang around a number of his caucus colleagues to tell him that he was going to tell them that he was going to be all right.
Not only that he was going to be all right, that he would be back with even more energy and vigour.
Oh yes, yeah.
Okay, well, on that privacy issue now, when you're trying to get the balance right between freedom of speech and the right to privacy, Michael, what's wrong with occasionally just looking at whether you've got the balance right?
Well, I think you saw with Brendan O'Connor there, what the heck was all that about? We're not sure whether we've got the balance right. All of a sudden, they've got the Australian Law Reform Commission report. This is volume 3. Then, this is 3 years ago, and then by the time you get to page, 2,536, they start talking about a right to personal privacy. This privacy thing is one of these issues, and I think what you've got here is a government that is in a lot of trouble. It's unstable. It's one operation away from biting the dust. It's got the Australian people against it. It's got 27% primary vote, and it's a sign of a government in a lot of trouble that they start thrashing around and looking for people to blame, and they look to blame the media.
But this is not even media specific.
I think most of those points are right, but how is the government unstable, given they've managed to actually hold together a kind of Foxham and Jetsam coalition?
It's inherently unstable. You've got, it's under attack from any lobby group, even the cigarette companies.
They would say that.
But cigarette companies are now
taking tough action, and the cigarette companies are complaining. That's sign of unstable
any government that is one seat away from defeat is trying to bring in a great big new tax. Whatever you think about that, it's an inherently unstable government. It's one seat away, and they're feeling the pressure. So you've got the Prime Minister coming out, starting to claim there's hard questions, which. What are the hard questions that News Limited here has to answer about the scandal that's happening in Britain?
See, I think that just tends to confuse the two, because the privacy laws are not only are they not News Limited specific, but they're not media specific. But they can be about the media, and it's about the intrusive nature of the media, and you'd have to accept that the public is concerned about that at times.
I think the public are, but I think the effort this week was to sort of send the balloon up in the air and see if they could conflate the two issues in the public mind as well, seizing the moment from what had happened overseas. Well, and I think it was a tactical mistake from Julia Gillard to talk about News Limited here rather than News International and the parent company.
And you've got the Communications Minister claiming that there's sections of the media intent on regime change. The media minister shouldn't really be trying to get into a war with the media. The Prime Minister shouldn't be trying to take this scandal on the other side of the world to try and divert attention from their own failings, basically, onto the media, and using something called some old report here that they've dusted off. This privacy stuff, it's one of those things.
It's a genuine report, though. It still exists, and there are recommendations there that need to be looked at.
And they have been working through it.
So they say.
You wouldn't want to be in a hurry or anything, Dennis.
It's one of those terms, very privacy. Everyone's in favour. Privacy. I think we had trouble getting the list of the 500 carbon polluters because
it was
of
supposedly
privacy.
Commercial in confidence.
Because of privacy. Well, I think we had trouble getting the list of people who are running in the Olympic torch relay because of privacy.
Let's take the case though, and there was a case with tabloid television where a repairman was targeted for really pathetic kind of accusations of overcharging for minor jobs, right? And they invaded his workplace and checked him out, and he came under national scrutiny and was found dead the next day in his garage. Now, it's that kind of thing, surely, that people just don't like, and maybe if there's a way of people getting recompense against the media in terms of being able to sue them, then what's wrong with that?
You can always find examples on either side of this.
Well, and therefore, if there are examples...
And the other side. But I'd agree more with Murray Gleeson, former Chief Justice of Australia, who warned against this whole push. It's from the Law Reform Commission. Now, I find it, not a very good report at all. Everyone says, oh, this is the Australian Law Reform Commission. It's just a bunch of lawyers putting a very, very wordy make-work scheme for lawyers out there along the rubric of we should stop people's privacy being invaded. Much like defamation and negligence, we've just been through two major episodes of reform of tort. Remember the negligence, we had the death of fun so that you can't have your kids playing in a playground anymore because lawyers and the law of negligence has made it too costly for councils to have. And the same thing will happen with privacy.
Look, I accept it's hard to find a journalist who is in favour of any of this.
No, I'm talking about the Chief Justice.
On the issue of privacy generally, hang on, Dennis, you on this, on the question of privacy generally, just go back to the Australia card and when that was raised and see the community resentment to that because they don't like their personal details being available.
Absolutely, yes, and people are against people building up databases. They're against governments doing it in particular, but they're also against private organisations doing it. I think anybody who has had their privacy invaded, whether it's by a current affairs TV show or whether it's by the Department of Health, they feel it pretty acutely. And you're quite right about the Australia card. What seemed like a common sense proposal on paper turned into something that 80% of the population just said no to.
If we're going to have a debate about privacy, I think it's absolutely essential that we also talk about why political parties get an exemption from some of these laws to collect a whole lot of information that voters are maybe well unaware is being collected about them.
I think that's a very big point. The privacy laws, as Mish is pointing out, the political parties, Brendan O'Connor's party, they have probably the most detailed database.
Both major parties.
Both major parties of Australians. The politicians have sought exemption from the privacy laws. Now this is being wheeled out as part of this, of what the Labor Party is trying to do to have a go at the media. They're wheeling this one out. The privacy thing is really an attack on free speech. Now we all say, we don't want... It
doesn't have to be.
We don't want our privacy...
It doesn't have to be an attack on free speech.
But we don't want our privacy to be invaded.
Right. Yeah.
But if you're living next door to... If your financial advisor has been found guilty in the past of fraud, you'd want to know about that.
Yeah, I'd want to know about that.
If the person who wants to babysit your children...
There are rules that financial advisors who are convicted of fraud can't operate as financial advisors.
Or maybe has even been cleared of fraud through perhaps a technicality, you might want to know about that.
Yeah.
You might want to know if the person next door to you had committed some sort of sex offence and you're thinking, oh, maybe they can look after my kids for a while.
OK, the water's got a bit muddy this week, Misha, because of Julia Gillard's statement that News Limited here had hard questions to answer. Her response to that now, I think, is, well, wouldn't any corporation, any large corporation that has undergone these kind of internal ructions, wouldn't it be sensible to go ahead and do it? And in fact, that's precisely what they're doing with the help of a couple of retired judges. But it kind of muddied, the issues then converged.
It did, and there's also another broader debate that's happening here about, which has been pushed by Bob Brown and the Greens, on is there a need for a parliamentary inquiry into looking at a much broader sweep of media issues about ownership and diversity and those other things as well.
I'll give you one other just before you go on. Here is Christine Mill.
Do you think that News Limited should be broken up?
Oh, look, I think that is a in the Australian context for News Limited, I think that's something that should come out in the inquiry. So that and licensing newspapers, which I think is misunderstanding why television stations are licensed by them extending it to newspapers. This is the Greens, this is the far left Greens wanting to regulate our media, what they call the hate media, and they want to take basically the government to regulate what you and I can read and see on our newspapers. This is a total outrage. But you can't see it going very far. Well, I suspect there probably will be an inquiry because there is a kind of an inquiry, yes, but licensing newspapers. No, and that's the really interesting thing, that say an inquiry runs and it finds that, you know, in a perfect world you wouldn't have 70% of the country's newspapers owned by the one entity. Well, yes, but then what do you practically do about that? And I saw Stephen Conroy this week saying, well, divestiture is just not an option because
basically then the government would have to pay Rupert Murdoch a lot of money to, say, buy the Courier or Adelaide Advertiser or whichever paper they decided to offload if you tried to force divestiture. Would taxpayers be happy with that? Probably not. And then you might see a scenario where in an era where newspapers' business models is becoming ever more fraught, one or some of those papers could close. That wouldn't be a good outcome for...
So Senator Conroy has pretty much shut the door to it, has he, in that sense? Even though media concentration is an issue that is looked at occasionally.
Well, it's looked at, and there are laws that govern it. But, I mean, far be it from me to agree with my boss, but I think John Hartigan was right when he said that this was opportunistic. It was. It was an opportunistic entry into the debate by the Prime Minister and other ministers. But also it was just dumb politics, because the debate started with the Greens, as Misha said, and this was another example of the government looking like it was following the lead of the Greens, and at the moment that is poison out in the electorate for the Labor Party.
I've got to take on this, the 70% of Australian newspapers, controlled by... Australia's got quite a diverse media outlook. If you're in the two major cities, Melbourne and Sydney, you've got a metro broadsheet, you've got a tabloid, you've got a national newspaper, and you've got a national financial newspaper. And you've got going by two different companies. In Melbourne and Sydney, the News Limited doesn't have a paper at all in Canberra, doesn't have a paper in Perth. It happens to have a paper in Adelaide, where Rupert Murdoch sort of set up, it's got a paper in Brisbane. But what if you start sort of...
Yeah, but it's a monopoly.
but Fairfax have tried to make a play into Brisbane online in the future. Now, I'm not sure how they're going.
Not very well.
Fairfax have tried to make a play into Adelaide with The Age. And if once you start on this sort of break-up rule and clamping down, you could get newspapers, basically, you could accelerate the death of newspapers. We could have less media diversity in the end. And really, this is like the Greens trying to have a go and exploiting the weakness of the Labor Party now to try and introduce more media regulation to Australia and control what
they can try, but the question is, will they achieve anything?
Not everyone lives in Melbourne and Sydney, and there are some parts of the country where there isn't that kind of broad diversity of sources for regular access and quality news about what's going on in people's local patch, and that's where this issue is felt much more keenly, I think.
Yes.
But I also don't have a problem
with
us having a discussion
town in Perth. What are you going to do about that?
Yeah, well, absent forced divestiture, which, reality says is not an issue, why wouldn't there be merit, though, in having a discussion about how the landscape should evolve over time and whether there should be rules about concentration over time? I don't see that as being a huge problem.
I don't think there's any problem in having that discussion, but I would say that there are much more important issues on Australia's plate at the moment, and I think the government should be looking at those rather than this. I think this was an opportunistic attack, and it was aimed at News Limited. It's aimed at the Daily Telegraph, the Australian and the Herald Sun, which the government, people in the government, think are treating the government and some of its policies unfairly. And, that is, to me, just dumb politics.
Well, let's move on to one of those issues.
But I've just got to bring it back
very quickly.
If we are looking at this issue, if we're looking at the issue of sort of hacking, I think in Australia the main issue of hacking-like behaviour that has gone on recently has not been in News Limited. It's been The Age that has got access to the ALP's database.
That's not hacking.
It's hacking style.
No, investigative journalists.
I think it's probably a good thing. I'm not against
access
it.
from a source that had authorised access to material. No, I'm not going to cop that. To equate
it's just silly.
That with hacking into a dead girl's voicemail. No,
I'm not equating, but it's the only...
A source with authorised access gave access to an individual journalist. So what are you saying?
Hang on a second. Let Misha answer that allegation.
If a cabinet source divulges a piece of cabinet material to me, what am I supposed to sit around and go, I'm not going to write that because the law of the land says cabinet materials are protected by law? No way, of course I'm going to write that.
I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but it's the closest thing to getting into a database.
There is no moral equivalence between the two.
Well, and I say the only cases of privacy that have got to the court, the main ones, have involved the ABC. And it's been the ABC in instances where animal liberation people have broken into abattoirs and shown film, or where the ABC inadvertently, by mistake, has published the name of a victim of a rape case. They're the main privacy concerns that have got to court. Yep. Very little to do with News Limited.
OK, and as I started by saying, none of this is specific to News Limited. It's about the media generally.